Can you talk a little bit about working with David on his first movie and his first foray into directing and working with the DP, who I think it's Juan Ruiz Anquilla? Yeah. Talk about setting up a scene and that process with them.
One thing, first of all, he wasn't supposed to direct the movie. It was supposed to be Peter Yates, the great British director Peter Yates, who had done Bullet and The Dresser and a lot of other things. I wound up doing a picture with him afterwards called The Suspect with Cher and Dennis Quaid. But Peter Yates was supposed to direct that film, and then something happened. Peter got, contractually had to do something else. And he's the one that told David, he says, do it. You're ready. Just do it yourself. Because Dave was going to actually postpone it and wait till Peter. And that's what, and David, I think he said, when he wrote his book later, he even says in the book how about like the night before his first, he was thrown up in the bathroom. He was so nervous about it. But you would never know it on the set. I mean, this is a guy that came in, he's a control freak, so he was prepared. He may have felt some queasiness and all, but boy, he knew exactly what he wanted. We had a good amount of rehearsal, probably had too much rehearsal. I think we had 2 weeks of rehearsal on the movie. And in my 40 plus years now in the business, I've come to realize 2 weeks of rehearsal on a movie is way too much normally, because there comes a point where, okay, let's just shoot it. Let's just, let's roll some film here. But he was, this was his first time out as a director, film director, and he had a great cinematographer in Juan Ruiz Anquilla, and it all worked. It just was. I look back at it; it was a totally pleasant experience. We were all surrounded by people we all knew. It was very much a family kind of situation, but he never hesitated. I never felt that he was grasping for anything in terms of like that he was lost. And if he felt that, it never came across.
Was he? So you said he's very specific. Was he specific about his visuals, or did they kind of come up?
He was specific about a lot of things. Because to tell you the truth, I was confused somewhat during the shooting of it, because I'm thinking, the thing is so complex. And I'm not that complex a person, so it's like I'm thinking to myself, I hope he knows what he's doing, because I'm some of this I'm not even sure where I'm going with it. And I've even had people tell me, like the one scene where I tell the thing about the tell. I pull her over. I say, look, let me tell you something. I remember as I was doing it, I'm thinking, I'm not sure. I don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. And I would look at Dave. I says, is this? Yeah, no, good. Yeah, right. You just say the words. You're good. And I was like, okay. Because it was so much of it was unfamiliar to me. So again, it was an education. So I was learning some of that stuff as I was doing it. But he knew. Every moment of that film, I think he had in his head. He had already figured it all out. And it was so a lot was based on trust. You just kind of go ahead and you acquiesce to somebody like that. And say, okay, I'm taking the ride. Let's go.
Ricky, how about you in your first movie working with David on his first movie as a director?
Well, it's such a different experience from Joey's. We've never sat down and talked about this because part of my role, actually a lot of my role, was working out the cons with David. And so there are two separate things that happen. One is my relationship to the cons, and the other is my relationship with the actors. In terms of the actors, I now realize in retrospect what was frightening for me, which was to put in the midst of these absolutely marvelous actors, where I had done absolutely nothing like this in my life. I'd been on stage from the time I was a kid, and I was very comfortable on stage, but suddenly I'm in scenes with Joey and Mike Nussbaum and J.T. Walsh, and it's just astounding. But they made me feel incredibly comfortable, and their level of expertise, I think, helped me enormously. But the other side of it is David wrote a con. For instance, the con that Mike Nussbaum winds up doing with the 19 singles and the $20 bill. He wrote a version of that, and he said to me, so what do you think? And I said, it's really good. And he said, that bad? And I said, yeah. And so we then discussed what to do with this con, and he wanted to know the real con in that situation, and I felt very uncomfortable because I had friends who were out making a living doing a version of the flute. And so he said, well, what can we do? And I said, let me think about it for a while, and I invented the method that we see in the film. So the whole idea of stealing the bill with your mouth was, I think, an original method of doing this. And then David asked if I would allow Mike Nussbaum to do it in the movie. So that was a very strange thing to do as well, to have Mike do it, but I soon realized that he was absolutely right. I mean, it would have made no sense for me to do it at all. So then my job became to make sure that Mike would do it well, and he did it beautifully. So I was being put in all sorts of unusual situations as well, and as Joey said, I mean, it was so easy to give him your trust that you understood it was both the start of a confidence game and a great friendship.
Can you talk about you both play roles in this movie, but most of your role, you're playing another role in the elaborate con, because most of your screen time is a con on Lindsay Crouse. So how did you approach that? Was that something you were thinking about all the
Well,
time?
it was interesting, and there was some concern. I mean, because we would talk about it, and one of David's concerns was, tipping the movie too early. In other words, there was always that fear of that the audience is going to get ahead of us and kind of figure out before Lindsay does, what's going on. And in fact, I remember when the first review came out with Siskel and Ebert back then. Ebert or Siskel or both of them basically said, well, we saw the movie, we watched it, we saw the thing, and then the thing with the squirt gun and all that. And they were both almost ready to walk out of the film because they said, this is bullshit. We know where this is going. And then apparently when they finally realized that the whole thing spun around, it was like it blew them away. And they wound up, I remember later, at the end of the 80s, in 1990, they listed the 10 best films of the decade, and they listed House of Games as one of the 10 best films of the 80s, which was pretty cool. So to go from almost walking out of the theater to that was pretty cool.
Well, I remember David saying to me, does this work, from a sleight of hand point of view, from the view of tricking someone? Does this work? And I said that it's almost impossible to answer that question without a real audience. And he said, all right, let's get one. And we went to, you'll know the name of this theater, it's the theater in Chicago where the lady in red caught Dillinger.
The Biograph.
The Biograph, exactly. And Davey and I snuck into the Biograph for the first preview, once the movie started, and watched it. And when you heard the gasp as Steve Goldstein drove off in the Cadillac, that was the first tell that there was really a con. I mean, we knew we were home free.
Yeah, the moment he most worried about was actually the moment when Lindsay goes into the bank and gets the money. There's that little scene with Mike Nussbaum and I are sitting in the car together. We don't really say anything, and then I just say that one line, which is a little innocuous line. It's funny when things happen or something like that. And we always wondered, like, that's the moment. People go, wait a minute. Hey, she's going to get the, wait a minute. But for the most part, I mean, some people may have certainly got it and whatever, but I would think for the most part, people enjoyed the ride.
Now, a lot of you saw it for the first time tonight. Show of hands, any of you ahead of the curve? Did you figure it out?
Only because people in here were laughing so hard.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, and then the other thing that happens is it is very much like a sleight of hand effect, which is the second you see how it works, pardon me for saying this, some of you convince yourselves that you knew how it worked before you knew how it worked. It's just one of the things people do naturally. And that's why it was so great to sneak into the theater and see the real reaction the first time.
Talk about working with Lindsay Crouse.
Well, it's funny. They were married at the time, and the scene where I seduce her basically in the hotel room. He said, okay, music's gonna play, and then he says we're not gonna actually show, but obviously it's gonna be like there's gonna be this moment, and then we'll cut to afterwards. So and I'm being very cool. I'm thinking this is his wife. I mean, okay, I'm gonna be very cool about it. So he says, okay, but now, he'd written in it, I kiss her passionately. Hey, I'm Italian. If I say kiss her passionately, I'm gonna go for it. So I remember. So we didn't really rehearse it. We just figured, okay, we know the lines. Okay, we'll just shoot it. So he said, action. We do the scene. We get to that kiss we have, and And it went on for a little bit, and then we finished the scene. And it was so funny, right when he says cut, he went, I look at him, and he looked at me, and I says, hey Dave, you're gonna throw me in the deep end, I'm gonna swim. And he goes, yeah, well, I think we got that. I don't think we need to do that one again. And so, I mean, it was kind of funny. I was in a similar situation years later when I did the movie Alice, Woody Allen, and had almost exact the same situation with Mia Farrow. It's funny, neither of those marriages ultimately worked out, so I'm not taking the blame for any of that. It was kind of interesting.
Ricky, how about you working with Lindsay?
Well, I enjoyed it very much. I mean, it really was. It's the same thing, this great ensemble of people. All of them were friends, all Chicago folk, and they just were incredibly generous to me, both on stage and off. So it's a very pleasant experience.
Do you have any stories about working with J.T. Walsh or Mike Nussbaum or any of the other cast members?
Well, God, we all had a long history. You know, first of all, J.T. was in the original production of Glengarry with me as well, and we did that for a year on Broadway and toured it for about 6 months. So, and then I wound up doing about 4 or 5 films with J.T. Walsh. I mean, he was a brilliant actor. And it was a big career changer for him as well. I mean, doing Williamson and Glengarry Glen Ross really changed his career and gave him ultimately all the great film roles he wound up doing. Mike Nussbaum, he was a mainstay of Chicago theater. He and I did the very original production of A Life in the Theater, David Mamet's play, back in like 1976. But what was the case back then, this was before David was really, had established himself to the level he ultimately became as a writer. So while we did the original production in Chicago, we used to call it the Chicago Shuffle. In other words, you would do the Chicago production of something, and then of course they'd open it in New York with name, stars and stuff. So we didn't wind up doing the New York production. But Mike and I, we'd gone back to the 70s working together. So it was very comfortable to work with. Mike is still working today. Mike is in his 90s. Mike's in his early 90s and is still one of the mainstays of Chicago theater. So it's great. I mean, we all have this. Jack Wallace, was in the film. J.J. Johnson, who's in a lot of the Mammoth films. The play American Buffalo is dedicated to J.J. Johnson. These are guys that, I mean, talk about colorful guys. These are the guys that I think Dave, has drawn a lot of his inspiration from. These real guys. I mean, these guys, the only thing that exceeded the amount of time they were on stage was the amount of years they spent in prison. So, I mean, it's a real mixed bag of these. They're all older now. They've mended their ways many years ago. But they're just tremendous characters and obviously great fodder for Dave to draw from. I mean,
and we still see them all the time. And,
yeah, all the time.
And they're wonderful. I mean,
all the time.
this thing has continued on and on.
Yeah.
It's great.